the second follow-up episode to our brief look at Augustine of Hippo. In the first, we dove a little deeper into his work, The City of God, because of its monumental impact on forming the theology of the European Middle Ages, which was the crucible of the modern world. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a less consequential chapter in Augustine's story. That's his involvement in the controversy with Pelagius. We do so really for one reason. Though it doesn't fit into the overall theme of Season 1 of Communio Sanctorum to devote a whole episode to what really is just a chapter in Augustine's story, something emerges from it that lingers today. It resurfaces every time in a theological discussion or debate someone accuses the other of being Pelagian, or more commonly being semi-Pelagian. It's not my intent here to argue the merits of either side in that discussion, though I do, of course, have my views. In this episode, I simply want to provide viewers a little historical context to what those terms mean. And so here goes. Following his refutation of the Donatists, Augustine turned his impressive intellectual attention to the teaching of a British monk named Pelagius. Pelagius's beginnings in Britain are really obscure. Nothing is known of his origins. While the evidence says that he began in Britain, the typically sneering Jerome mocks him as Irish. For whatever reason, he arrived in Rome in 380, where he was immediately disturbed by the moral laxity that he observed in the churches there, especially among the upper classes. These people seemed to want instruction, but treated what they learned as mere academic exercise rather than instructions to alter their behavior. These elites gathered round them what they deemed suitably capable teachers. There was no dearth of candidates vying to make it onto their demanding roster, but few did. And when the haughty but certified scholar Jerome left Rome in 384, Pelagius stepped into the vacancy left by him. His fluency in both Greek and Latin combined with his lucidity in theology to propel him into the spotlight. But his was an unlikely choice, since Pelagius made no secret of his campaign to reform the morality of the Roman Church. He concluded that what had led to the abysmal state of morality in Rome was a faulty view of grace and human ability. This led him straight into conflict with Augustine because it was his work that had best articulated the theology of many, though by no means all, on these fronts. It seemed to Pelagius that Augustine reduced human beings to mere tools of divine pleasure. Augustine represented a group of church leaders who fell in line with the thinking of another North African theologian of 2 centuries before. You may remember him from earlier episodes, Tertullian. Now, elaborating on the seed thoughts that Tertullian proposed, Augustine and those like him said that humanity was irrevocably broken by sin. Because all humanity was in Adam when he fell, they fell with him, and proved the truth of it. When they finally arrive in the world, they sin themselves. No exceptions. Though that's a greatly simplified take, it's called the doctrine of original sin. Now, Pelagius thought this was a dangerous excuse for sin and that it robbed people of any reason to attempt trying to be good, at making any effort at being moral. He thought people would think, well, if I'm already guilty but haven't done what I'm declared guilty of, I might as well go ahead and do it because I'm already guilty for it. Now, that wasn't really what original sin said, but it fit the narrative that Pelagius had already settled on. He was set on improving the morality of the people of Rome through a rigorous campaign of asceticism. He said that our God-given nature has been damaged, but it isn't completely corrupted. We can, he claimed, make right and good choices on our own. But I need to qualify that because Pelagius acknowledged that the very ability to make a choice comes from God. He said, quote, that we are able to see with our eyes is no power of ours, but it is in our power that we make a good or bad use of our eyes. The fact that we have the power of accomplishing everything good by action, speech, and thought comes from him who has endowed us with this possibility and also assists it, unquote. As often happens, it was Pelagius's followers who pressed his views further. They cried foul on the idea of original sin. The guilt of Adam's sin was not, they said, passed on to the rest of humanity. Rather, Adam was just a bad example that we ought to ignore. We are free to choose God apart from divine assistance or enabling. Now, in this, Pelagius' followers most likely went further than their leader. Well, Augustine went to work on refuting Pelagius when refugees from Italy began arriving in North Africa after the sack of Rome in 410. Some of these refugees went to work spreading Pelagius' ideas in their new homes. Augustine was concerned that their ideas would start up yet another controversy on top of the Donatists. While his relationship with Pelagius himself remained polite, the same cannot be said for the way that it worked out with his followers. Moves and countermoves saw a complete mix of schemes as the two camps tried to outmaneuver each other for control of the doctrinal narrative. Augustine prevailed, and the Council of Carthage in 418 declared Pelagianism a heresy. Not long after, the term Pelagian came to be a kind of umbrella term for all heresy, and that's the way things sat until more recent times. More recent scholars have revisited Pelagius' teachings, at least what they could find of them. Unfortunately, it seems that a lot of his critics rounded up his works and burned them. The modern take on Pelagius is that he regarded the human race as less vile, less broken than Augustine, and so had a more positive view of human nature. Maybe he did. But we ought not miss the fact that Pelagius was a staunch, strict moralist. He envisioned the church as something very different from Augustine, who in the City of God said it not as a collection of living, holy, moral saints, but as a community of people who by God's grace have been changed and who want to be holy, but who, this side of heaven, will ever strive and never arrive. Contrasting the two, for Augustine, sanctification was a process carried on by the sovereign activity of the Holy Spirit. And then I need to be careful here, because for Pelagius himself, as opposed to his later followers, the emphasis and energy for being holy lay within the grasp of men and women, but it was accompanied by God's grace. As I said, it was his immediate and later followers who pressed the responsibility of Christians to work their side of the holiness equation that led eventually to placing the entire burden of sanctification on human endeavor. Then they worked the process backward and said that salvation itself was a product of human will. We saw this process of followers hijacking a founder's ideas with Nestorius, you may remember. While Nestorius was honorary and politically inept, and while he struggled with framing his thoughts on the nature of Christ in accurate terms, he was orthodox in his beliefs, as proved by the Chalcedonian Council and Creed, though by then he was regarded as a heretic. It was Nestorius' followers, now on the outs with the Western Church, who reframed his ideas along more aberrant lines. What we may discern in the difference between these two, that is Augustine and Pelagius, is their own unique experiences with temptation and sin. Remember that before his conversion, Augustine had struggled with the besetting sin of sexual avarice. His many-year quest to gain mastery over this area of his life proved fruitless until he surrendered to Christ. And we might assume from the long record of human experience and our own stories that sexual temptation didn't end overnight for Augustine. He knew the presence of that brokenness in himself even after being born again. But he also discovered a new center that saw him able to resist its pull that he'd not had before. This he attributed to the sovereign agency of God's enabling grace and not to anything within himself. Though we know nothing of Pelagius' background in Britain, that he was shocked at the immorality of Roman Christians when he first arrived, we may infer that he already had a finely tuned sense of right and wrong with moral discipline in sync with it. Maybe the biggest impact of Pelagius was in how the contest with him influenced Augustine's theology. It appears to some biographers that Augustine's defense of original sin and his emerging views on the necessity of God's grace may have moved him to dig out some of his old ideas that he had picked up years before from the Manichaeans and the Stoics. Combining all of that led him to conclude that salvation is so completely a work of God that it lies in the time before time and rests in the inscrutable will of God. Some would say that because Augustine maintained salvation was so utterly independent of anything in man, that God's choice was arbitrary, lying in some divine reason beyond human ability to ever know. It ought to be noted that Augustine's ideas did not meet with automatic, unanimous approval. It's not like when he published these things, church leaders said, well, of course, this is what we've always believed. Criticism of his theology of grace was widespread, but it was wrapped in a pill that was easy at that time to swallow. The city of God that we looked at in our last episode. The Western Christian world was so eager to make sense of the fall of Rome, they ate up Augustine's analysis and vision. It offered hope at a time when it was desperately needed, and it provided a blueprint for how to move forward. So along came his ideas on the nature of grace and salvation. But they remained mostly quiet in the background until the Reformation, when theologians returned to the writings of the church fathers. Then Augustine's views on predestination and election were resurrected by one branch of the emerging Protestant movement, but not all. Other Protestants replied with the same objections that had been used when Augustine first proposed his ideas. And the debate goes on today, with modern-day adherents of Augustine calling those who disagree with them Pelagian, which has come to mean not what Pelagius himself actually taught, but what some of his followers eventually said, that people can be saved by living a holy life apart from the atoning work of Christ. But non-Augustinian Christians would say they don't believe that. They contend that there is no salvation apart from Christ, but that people come to faith in him by responding to the conviction of the Holy Spirit who woos and wins them. The label semi-Pelagian has been assigned to this position by Augustinians and is deemed as heretical as full Pelagianism. It's interesting that this view is called semi-Pelagian, when in truth it's more aligned with what Pelagius himself taught. Confused? Well, welcome to the club. I'm going to deal with all of this more fully in season 2 of the podcast and the episode titled Heretics, part 5. Was he really?